So here we are. We're fighting for the very survival of the Green Party and an independent left in this country, so that candidates like Bob Alton and Steve Greenfield can just be on the ballot. We got a governor, when the New York Times found out about it, they called it the Democrats' secret plan to kill third parties. And that's what they want to do. What other self-respecting democracy has the two governing parties administering elections so they can keep their competition out? We have political hacks from both parties on the boards of election. And whenever there's disputes like we're having in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, in Montana, it's these hacks that decide our fate. And in Wisconsin, it's strictly party line vote. And they blaming us. We just trying to exercise our First Amendment rights to bring our programs forward. And so we know about the Republicans' voter suppression efforts, right? Purging the voter rolls, not putting enough polling places in black communities, having stupid photo ID requirements like in Wisconsin, where a student ID doesn't count, so those University of Madison or Wisconsin students in Madison can't vote. And black folks can't vote because a lot of them don't have driver's licenses because they use public transportation in the hood in Milwaukee. And that's what's going on in Wisconsin. Instead of fighting that, the Democrats are fighting our right to exercise our First Amendment right to run. And you're going to be reading about this. You might have seen on the cable news like they're blaming us. The Democrats set this up. My running mate, Angela Walker, working class black woman, came up in Milwaukee. Democrats in Wisconsin know who she is. She brought her local amalgamated transit workers, Local 998, into the Wisconsin uprising when the Republicans attacked collective bargaining rights. Her union was exempt, like the police and the firefighters, because it was a divide and conquer strategy by the Republicans. And then she was very critical when the Democrats said, "Get off the streets, workers. We'll take care of it. We'll have a recall election." That failed. And because she was so prominent there, people in Milwaukee said, "You got to run for sheriff against this crazy David Walker, a Trump-loving conservative Democrat." Democrats know who she is. She got 20% of the vote running as an independent socialist. They don't want her on the ballot in Wisconsin because people know who she is. So we're in a situation there where the Democrat, they're saying we're holding up the absentee ballots. No, it's not us. The Democrats got a bogus complaint. She moved during the petitioning period. We notified the Wisconsin election commissions, and she certified her current address with an affidavit, declaration of candidacy when we filed our petitions. We needed 2,000. The staff of the Wisconsin Election Commission said we have well over 3,000. We had enough people signing our petition, but they said she gave them the wrong address on the early petitions. But that's what the Wisconsin Election Commission said to do. And then they had a hearing with a heavy gavelled Democrat not letting us present our evidence. So we had to take them to court. And now you got the Democrats blaming us and saying the Republicans are trying to stop the election. So we're saying, make a ruling already, Republicans. The Republicans are the majority on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Or the Democrats can withdraw their complaint. We don't want to stop the vote. But it's not us doing it. And so we got to understand that they're going to make us the villain when they're the villains. When they talk about the Greens spoiling elections, no, it's black voter suppression. 100,000 in Florida in 2000. George's brother Jeb got the campaign chair, who was the Secretary of State, to disenroll 100,000 black voters who likely would have voted for Gore. And they want to blame Ralph Nader. And then in 2016, there was 75,000 ballots in Detroit that were never counted because the Republican Secretary of State put in broken scanners. So they couldn't run them through, so they put them in a box. And they were never counted. Greens took them to court, not the Democrats. And the Republican Secretary of State said, well, this is fishy. We got more votes than were scanned. We can't recount them. And of course, the Greens are saying, that's exactly why we need to count them. And the Democrats, Clinton had a couple lawyers there, and the judge, even though they weren't party to the case, turned to them and said, well, do you have anything to say? Oh no, we're just observing. And then the Democrats turn around and blame us. And like Steve was saying, they are making this out to be, you gotta vote for Biden, no matter what. Well, we face life or death issues, and the Democrats have no solutions. In fact, this is the most vacuous, issueless presidential campaign in my lifetime, and that goes back to 1952. When you think of Joe Biden, what's he for?
Nothing.
Yeah, he's Uncle Joe. He's not as bad as mean old Donald Trump. You know, at least we know Donald Trump's for the wall. Of course, the Republicans didn't even adopt the platform. They just said whatever Trump wants, you know, and Trump we trust. Might as well put that on a dollar bill, as far as the Republicans are concerned. But Joe Biden, as Steve pointed out, is a legislative architect of mass incarceration. And that was Clinton's idea. When Clinton unveiled that when he was running in 1992, he did a photo op at Stone Mountain, Georgia, the spiritual home of the Ku Klux Klan, with a bunch of prisoners, almost all black, behind him. And he laid out this program. I mean, I can't even think of a photo op Donald Trump's done like that. That's your lesser evil. And then look at police brutality and systemic racism. The police we got are what the Democratic machines want, because they're funded by the real estate industry, which profits 6 different ways off of segregation. And we're more segregated now than we were by both race and class when the Fair Housing Act passed in 1968. And they had the police policing the boundaries of the new Jim Crow, which are the municipal lines and the school district lines. And their mission is to keep downscale people down, particularly black people, and out of the upscale communities. That's why over 80% of what they do is harass poor people of color for low-level offenses and non-criminal behavior, as well as harass us all with tickets, but they target the black community. Only 5% of what they do relates to violent crime, and about another 12 or 13% to serious property crimes like burglary and carjacking. And they only clear about 25% of those cases with arrest. That's what we think the police are supposed to do. They don't even do a good job at that. And the statistic that gets me the most, this is from the Vera Institute for Justice, a study they did a few years ago. 60% of the victims of those crimes don't even tell the police. Why? Because they don't trust them. If you're at the scene of a crime, either as a victim or a witness, you don't want the police coming because they say you at the scene of the crime. You might get arrested. That's the way people feel about it. And that's how corrupt the police are. So that's one life or death issue. Police are getting away with their murders, their assaults, and their rackets like civil asset forfeiture because they're able to police themselves. So we need community control of the police. We need police commissions, publicly elected, or I'd prefer just elected by lot like juries, random samples so the politics don't influence. And they would have the power to hire and fire the police chief, to set the policies, oversee the budgets, and independently investigate and discipline officers for misconduct. And clean out on some fascists. He ain't competent enough to be a fascist. Really, I mean, the guy's a dummy, he's a huckster, he's a racist, and he's hollowing out the federal government. You know, if he sent federal agents into Portland, a fascist would have just took over the police force and told the mayor, get the hell out of the way. Trump backed off when they gave pressure on him. He's got a fascist mind, but he's not going to execute it. But we got to worry because that fascism, which is the old racist bloc we've had in this country for our whole history, it's a minority because of gerrymandering and the electoral college. They got more power than they deserve. You know, we got to watch them. So that's one life or death issue. Also to deal with this question of systemic racism. In the war on drugs. Make marijuana legal, taxed, and regulated like we do tobacco and alcohol, which are more dangerous. And then the hard drugs, decriminalize them like Portugal did. So instead of a criminal charge, if you possess one of these illicit drugs, you get an appearance ticket and you go before a doctor, a social worker, and a lawyer. And they look at your situation and see how they could help. Do you need drug treatment? Do you need counseling because you're using drugs to cope with another problem? Do you need a job to stabilize your life? And since they started this in 2001 in Portugal, overdose deaths have disappeared. HIV is not spreading. There's not any drug-related street crime. And actually less people use those hard drugs, which is really important now because we got an opioid epidemic. It's killing too many people. People who might have got hooked because they've got painkillers, opioid painkillers from the doctor, they get addicted, then they got to go on the street, get heroin. A lot of it laced with this fentanyl. They don't want to let anybody know because it might be a criminal charge, and they end up dying. And this is not, and of course, the drug companies have been pushing the opioids. They should be prosecuted. So drug decriminalization, community control of the police, and then defunding the police. Okay, fine. If 80% of what they're doing is things they shouldn't be doing, should be done by other agencies. Okay, put that money there. But there's not enough money there. You could take the whole police department, you're not going to house the homeless, treat the addicted, or deal with all these other social problems. We need a federal program to rebuild these racially oppressed communities that have been segregated, discriminated, and exploited for generations. Needs to be multi-trillion dollars over multi-years. And you're not hearing anything like that from the Democrats or Republicans. So, systemic racism. And then another life or death issue, of course, is the COVID crisis. Donald Trump, he's a loser. COVID won, he lost. He's a loser. He knows what he should have done. He could have been the hero. He could have listened to public health advice and, done like the whole Pacific Rim did, like they did in Europe. Instead, he got some stupid ideas about keeping the economy going while people get sick and die. And of course, that's not what happened. So he's a dummy. But what about Joe Biden? He has had the national platform since he became the presumptive nominee. He didn't do a news conference asking questions and answers until a few weeks ago. He was invisible. He lives within commuter distance of the White House press corps. He used to commute to the Senate. He could have convened them in a socially distanced news conferences like Andrew Cuomo did, get on cable and pound away at the solution. Test, contact tracing, isolating those exposed and infected, suppress community spread of the virus, and we go back to work and to school safely. Instead, he just stands back and lets Trump allow tens of thousands of people to die. If you can help solve a problem and you don't, you're complicit. So don't say it's just Donald Trump. Where's the damn Democratic Party? They don't have a clear demand. Test, trace, and isolate. And while Biden was there, he could have pounded away on saving the Postal Service, the $600 supplement for unemployment insurance, and many other issues. There's not a clear message from him except he's Uncle Joe and he's a nicer guy than Donald Trump. And I'm afraid, he's not going to mobilize his base. They're going to stay home and say, I don't know what he's for, So that's another life or death issue. And then, these have come up. When I started this campaign, it was about 3 life or death issues. The climate emergency. You see the forest burning in California, where they're burning in the Amazon, Australia, in the Arctic, north of the Arctic Circle. The International Panel on Climate Change came out with their report 2 years ago about how we could stay below a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures, which is a threshold beyond which it really gets dangerous and disastrous. And they identified a global carbon budget of 420 gigatons carbon. We're emitting 42 tons a year. That's 10%. So we got 8 years left before we blow through that boundary, that budget. And of course, Donald Trump calls climate change a hoax, but Biden acts as if it's a hoax. His climate policy is terrible. He doesn't say it in so many words, but he wants to frack the hell out of the country. So we have natural gas-fired power plants, and then he says, but we're going to do carbon capture and sequestration. No, they're not. It's not economical. The only way they'll do that is that they're subsidized by the federal government, by you and me. And then he's pro-nuclear. For the first time in 50 years, the Democratic Party's saying we need more nuclear power plants. Well, we already saw that under the Biden-Obama administration. They provided loan guarantees to 6 nukes in South Carolina and Georgia. And already 4 of those nukes have been abandoned for cost overruns and construction delays. And there are 2 in Vogel, Georgia, that they're still pouring money into, but that's only because Brian Kemp, as Secretary of State, suppressed the black vote, stole the election, and got elected instead of Stacey Abrams. And he's the Republican from Georgia Power and the Southern company that owns Georgia Power. So they're squeezing Georgia ratepayers to build nukes. And nukes cost 2 or 3 times more than most forms of solar and wind power. So why the hell would you do that? So the Green New Deal has been the signature issue of the Green Party for the last decade, the 2010s. We ran on it here in New York in 2010. Our presidential candidate, Jill Stein, ran on it in 2012 and 2016, a Green New Deal for America. And then after the 2018 midterms, the Sunrise Movement and AOC sat in Pelosi's office. Then the media paid attention. It went viral. Well, great. The problem is the Democrats took the slogan and diluted the content. They eliminated the ban on fracking and new fossil fuel infrastructure, which is the first thing we got to do. Because if we don't stop that, we're going to be locked into decades more fossil fuel burning, and the planet is cooked. And they dropped the phase out of nuclear power. And then they extended the deadline to get to zero emissions from 2030 to 2050, which the climate science, like I just related, says is too late. And then they brought it to Congress as the non-binding resolution for a Green New Deal. And Pelosi's never let them vote on it. She calls it the Green Dream, derisively. And McConnell in the Senate said, oh, we'll let you vote on it because half you Democratic senators are running for president. Let's get you on the record. And so Schumer said, oh, this is a trick. We're going to vote present. And all those Democratic senators voted present, except 4 voted with the Republicans no on a Green New Deal. So if you think you're going to get a Green New Deal from the Democratic Party, and you know the Sunrise Movement is just mobilizing for the Democrats. The problem with these progressive Democrats is they call defeats victories and mislead the people. And that's why the whole country's been moving to the right, because we haven't had an independent left. The progressives get taken for granted. We get lost in the sauce when we give our votes to somebody like Biden. He didn't know we were for a Green New Deal or Medicare for all. We voted for Biden. We gave away our voice if we're progressives. We gave away our power. And we'll get taken for granted in a Biden administration. And that's what's at stake to keep the independent left alive when we get through the November 3rd election. So that's the climate emergency, which more and more people recognize. You know, the thing about the Green Program is the majority of people agree with us. After that sitting in Pelosi's office, a few weeks later, they polled America. Over 80% are for a Green New Deal, including 64% of the Republicans. But we're not getting one from the Democrats, let alone the Republicans. Second life or death issue is growing inequality. Working class life expectancies are in decline in this country. Think about that. This is a developed country, but we've had 45 years of stagnant wages, while housing costs and healthcare costs and going to college have gone through the roof. And so people are disappointed in what life turned out for them, and they're turning to alcohol, drugs, suicide with handguns, and a lot of people not being able to get health care. Here's an example. The man that lived downstairs from me in Syracuse, 60-year-old, low-wage worker on Medicaid. He needed some kidney medicine to maintain his kidneys. Medicaid gave him the diagnosis, but they didn't give him the drugs. He had to go pay for the body. We need universal rent control right now, like we did during World War II, when they were putting money into arms instead of housing, and rents were going up. As a stopgap measure to stop all these evictions and displacement due to rent rises. And then we need public housing done the right way, not just isolated projects in the worst part of town for people of color that further segregates them. But mixed income like they do in Europe. You got professionals, middle income working people, and low income people in the same developments. So it's a desegregation program. Give me an energy program. They'll be powered by clean energy and green materials. It'll be a jobs program, obviously. And by linking it to building a real transit system, we can create walkable communities and fight sprawl and inefficient use of resources, as well as an affordable housing program. So our eco-socialist Green New Deal budget calls for 25 million units over 10 years. Now there's a Green New Deal housing program we got from AOC and Bernie Sanders. They only call for 2.5 million units over 10 years. And I don't know where they got a number, but there's 10 million people that are low income, don't have access to affordable housing now. We need to build 25 million units if it's going to be desegregated housing, and 40% of those units are reserved for low income people. So those 10 million low income people have access to affordable housing. I mean, if you're going to propose a good program, which the AOC Sanders program is, scale it up to solve the problem. Don't play tokenism with us. So jobs, income, housing, healthcare, Medicare for all. We want to go further than socializing the payment. We want to socialize the delivery as well. Hospitals and clinics, we want to bring them into the public sector. Put the doctors and the nurses, the other healthcare workers, make them public employees and make them accountable to us through locally elected health boards. 2/3 by the public, 1/3 by the workers. They bring in expertise. So they answer to us so we can make sure every neighborhood's got the healthcare resources it needs and that we're rationally using. We don't want hospitals competing for customers with the latest MRI when some neighborhoods don't even have a clinic and a doctor that people can go to. That's what community control of a national health service can do. And we had a bill like that. Ron Dellums introduced back in the 70s. We had three options: Nixon, Kennedy, and Dellums. Nixon is Obamacare. Have the federal government mandate private insurance and subsidize it. Kennedy was single payer payment for services that are privately delivered. And the Dellums system was a democratic, socialized system. That's what we really need. And actually it's more cost effective than just socializing payment. So jobs, income, housing, health care. What am I leaving out? Oh, education. Child care and pre-K, right up through post-secondary, trade schools, colleges, continuing adult education should be public and free to the students. You know, the CUNY system was free from 1848 till 1976. We're a richer country now. There's no excuse. Most countries do provide public housing for everybody. And then finally, a secure retirement. You know, the boomers, because wages were stagnant and costs rose, they raised their families, and a lot of them are retiring only having Social Security to fall back on, so they continue working, they don't really retire. And some of them have student loans that get garnished off their Social Security check. That's criminal. We say double Social Security benefits so every senior's living above the poverty line. So that's an economic bill of rights to end poverty and economic despair. And then the last life or death issue that none of the major party leadership or presidential candidates have talked about is the new nuclear arms race, which the Democrats initiated with their nuclear modernization program with Republican support, and now Trump has continued. So the strategic nukes are becoming 6 times faster than they were. You no longer launch on warning. There's not time. You launch on anticipation. And they're putting more tactical nukes in the conventional forces. And these tactical nukes are pretty damn big. They're bigger than Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And they are deployed with the crazy military doctrine of escalate to de-escalate. So if you're losing in a conventional war, use some tactical nukes to throw back the other side, and then you de-escalate, which will never happen, as Daniel Ellsberg has shown us in his book, The Doomsday Machine, his second Pentagon Papers. He was a nuclear war planner before he was a Vietnam War planner. And he describes how once a few nukes fly, they all gonna fly, and we all gonna be dead. This is a life or death issue, should be a top campaign issue, and it hadn't even been discussed. So we're calling for peace initiatives. Cut the military budget 75%. Withdraw from these endless wars. Start withdrawing from these over 800 foreign military bases. Pledge no first use of nuclear weapons. Disarm to a minimum credible deterrent, and then go to the other nuclear powers and say, look, we're no longer a threat. We want complete and mutual nuclear disarmament. Because if there's ever a nuclear war, nobody's going to win. It's just going to kill us all. And go there with world public opinion. 3 years ago, and hardly anybody knows this, 122 nations agreed to a new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. The International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons got the Nobel Peace Prize for that. And I bet a lot of you don't even know that. Because the political leadership of these two corporate parties doesn't talk about it, and the corporate state media doesn't talk about anything they don't talk about. This is a life or death issue hanging over us. The bulletin of the atomic scientist says their doomsday clock the closest it's ever been to midnight. You'd think that'd be an issue worth talking about. And it's not. So here we are, an issueless campaign between the major party candidates. And we're trying to get our voice out there and stay on the ballot so people have an option. So what are we going to do? I think all of us got to start talking to these so-called progressives that say, I got to vote for Biden because I hate Trump. Trump is dangerous. Yeah, he is. But there are no solutions coming from the Democrats. Or they say, I'm not going to take a position. Man, everything gets to me. I came up in the San Francisco Bay Area when the Black Panther Party came up when I was a teenager. They had a slogan, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. You can't stay neutral. So I think we need to challenge our friends and say, oh, you know, I'm speaking for this group, we're not going to say where we stand. Take a stand. You know, this is life or death issues. We're not playing around. We really got to get serious because the climate, people dying because they're poor, and the nuclear arms race, the pandemic, and the racism that goes on, and we keep seeing more and more people killed by the police. And all they talk about is changing use of force policies. You know, they had a policy against chokeholds in New York City since 1993. They helped Eric Garner. So we need community control. We need structural change. We need power for the people. Not, you know, begging the Democrats from a position of powerlessness because we gave them their vote and got lost in the sauce. That's a dead-end strategy. We got to stop calling defeat victory. And we got to challenge these people in these progressive movements that are not looking at the cold, hard reality. We're getting our butts kicked on the climate, on war, on austerity. I mean, right here in New York, we got Democrats got the Assembly, the Senate, and the governorship. And as Bob was talking about, the stock transfer tax, that pretty much solves the fiscal problem. It's pennies on a trade for the traders, the rich folks. But Cuomo, Trump used to fund the Democratic machine in New York. That's what real estate people do. That's a power structure. He gave money to, you know, Kamala Harris and many other Democrats, Clintons and so forth. You know, when the election's over and they get behind closed doors, it's business time. They take care of business. And when it comes to the economy and foreign policy and environmental neglect, they're on the same page. They do fight over cultural issues. That's how they mobilize their respective bases. Those are important issues. But that's not all that's at stake. We got life or death issues at stake. So we got to go to these progressives. They try to shame us for voting for what we want. No, shame on them for voting for what they don't want. Shame on them for giving away their power. Shame on them for silencing their voice. And we got to do, you know, the old-fashioned stuff because, as Steve pointed out, the media is not covering us too much. We got to make phone calls, knock on doors, take names of people that are ready to come out, and then make sure they vote on November 3rd. As I think I mentioned, the only people that got enough votes to get us a ballot line this year, now that the law has been changed, and just to review that, we got to get 3 times as many votes as we used to get a ballot line. We got to get it twice as often, every 2 years instead of every 4 years. And if we lose that ballot line, we got to get 45,000 signatures in 6 weeks instead of 15,000, which makes New York probably the hardest state now in the country to get an independent candidate on the ballot. And this country, we got to understand, this is such an anti-democratic, we can't wait 4 years to challenge the presidency. They always tell us that. Real solutions can't wait. So let's go out there, get those votes, and shove this new law down Andrew Cuomo's throat. Thank you.